Good morning, everyone. Anybody need a little stretch? Do you want to stand up for a second? No, we're okay. You're smiling anyway. My name is Gil Kelley, and I hail from Portland, although now I am in San Francisco working as the director of essentially long-range planning and urban design for the city of San Francisco. Prior to that, worked for about a decade as the planning director for the city of Portland. And before that, in good old Berkeley, where I left a great legacy for Dina to live in. I'm going to talk mostly about the Portland example today because I think, as many of you know, it's a region that has long committed itself to regional scale planning and smart growth. So I think when Bill asked me to speak, he said, tell your Portland story. I think that will be of interest to people. I do come with humility, I should say, because although in Portland we've been at it for a while and I think have had some success, we're still learning there. We've made our mistakes. It hasn't always been easy, and I want to communicate some of the good and the not so easy to you today. So with a little luck, I'll be able to advance the slides in order. So really, I'm really talking about two questions. What have been Portland's approaches, and what have we learned? It's interesting to note both regions have committed themselves, and not all places in the country have, to this regional approach to urban planning and smart growth. Portland is a slightly less populous region of about 2.3 million. You're about 3.2 million, at least on the north side of the border. We started a little bit earlier than you did, and I wanted to set a little bit of the institutional context. I'm not really going to do a whole comparative study today. I'm going to dive into the Portland example, but just to kind of set it in a little bit of a contextual frame, mention a couple of things here. Both have some form of regional governance structure. In Portland, there's actually an elected metropolitan council, and that government called Metro actually has land use authority and also serves as the so-called MPO, or Metropolitan Planning Organization, for dispersing federal transportation funds. Both have had enabling legislation. I think I got the year off here. 2003, the state declared the allowance for you to have a consolidated planning and transportation agency here in the region. In the Portland area, that goes back really to the state land use planning law of the 1970s, and then successive attempts at area governments, and finally a chartered elected government in 1990. Both have regional plans. Both are in the process of being updated. So some of these are common elements and some are a little bit different. Excuse me here. There is, in both places, I think, an investment focus. There is this large framework of a regional plan, but there is a focus particularly on investing in these transit supportive districts or centers. In the Portland plan, they're called centers and corridors. In the San Diego lexicon, they are smart growth opportunity areas. So those are really what we're talking about today, and they are, as Bill Anderson mentioned, they're really larger than what we used to call TOD, or transit-oriented development, which was really kind of the immediate project clamped onto the side of a transit facility. Here we're really talking about, in my view, we should abolish the term TOD and replace it with transit supportive neighborhoods, because we really need to draw a little bit bigger frame around what we're talking about here. A couple of other key differences, though. Portland, early on through that state legislation, did set up a system by which all local plans have to be approved by the state, and in the intervening years, in around 1990, with the metropolitan government in Portland, it sort of became an interstitial level, so that the local plans in the Portland region, there are about 30 jurisdictions or so, all of those land use plans have to be compliant with the regional plan. So it's not voluntary, it's actually mandatory, including things like minimum densities and a spread of housing. Here you have some other kind of forces in California that are promoting that. The state requirements for the housing element has to be adopted every 5 years at least, talks about having every community have a spread of housing types and so forth. Unlike in recent years in California where redevelopment was abolished, it is a tool that's used in Oregon and was really, frankly, a big part of Portland's early success in getting some of the TOD work started. Regardless of the differences, I think the largest commonality here is in both cases that we are dealing with contained growth, both by geographic and policy measures. You've got the ocean and the hills, a county-wide land use plan that really said let's conserve a lot of the open spaces, so it really is forcing development to be a bit more compact. And that, of course, is done in the Portland region as well, and I think what's complemented that in both cases is this spine of the regional transit system that, as Dina described, really serves to carry workers primarily between employment centers in the region, but also serves intervening neighborhoods with access. So with those two things, I think really we have the groundwork in both places to create great neighborhoods. And I think that's what really has to be latched onto here is the opportunity, not simply to say, how do I get to the transit from my car from a long way off, but how do we actually grow these neighborhoods within a mile or so of the station itself to be very walkable, pleasant, desirable places to work, whereas, as Dina was reporting on, the market is actually seeing premiums for that. People want those places and are paying for that. And for any of you who are developers in the audience, think about those millennials. They're already there. They're out of their car. That's where they want to be, and that's who you should be building for. There's been a lot of talk. We're kind of captives of our history here in our planner speak. We tend to sort of boil this down to average densities that are needed to support transit and lower parking limits and that kind of thing. And those are true. Those are important to support that transit system over time and to get the most value out of it. But it's really not all there is. And in fact, what I'd like to do is reshape the picture here a little bit to say that transit supportive neighborhoods can actually be, they're not all the same. They can be scaled, some very dense, some more moderate, more regional hubs and neighborhoods. And buildings within them don't all have to look the same. So that, again, is part of sort of the imagery that we often conjure up. There's a great sameness or uniformity. And these images from Portland, in fact, are from neighborhoods that are supported by frequent transit. And you can see there's a variety that goes on there. What you also see in this imagery are some things that Dina alluded to, which are, it's not just buildings and a transit system, but there are a lot of other neighborhood amenities that go into making the place that really do sustain that development and attract people there to live, work, and play. One example in Portland that embodies this is the Pearl District. I had the pleasure as planning director there of doing a lot of work to bring that district along. And really it was a more holistic view of what a neighborhood should be that really launched the very kind of micro-scale transit, the Portland streetcar. This is an image of the first line there of the modern streetcar. I happen to live in the Pearl District. That is when I'm not in San Francisco. And, you know, this actually stops right at my building, and I'm about a 10-minute walk to the regional rail line. But the nice thing is, it's not just walking or getting out of the neighborhood to somewhere efficiently, but it's actually, this is a place to call home and a place to live, as these images want to do. So the idea of actually taking over public spaces, reprogramming them for people, paying a lot of attention to the design both of buildings and of the public realm, the landscape, providing a whole mix of housing types and affordability levels. There's actually about 25% of the units there are affordable to low and moderate income people, and that percentage is actually growing a bit. And to some extent, the office and commercial portion is growing relative to the housing. So let me step back and then talk just a bit about the Portland region experience. These are sort of the key strategies. These 7 are really the key strategies that are embodied in the regional, what we call the 2040 plan in Portland. Urban growth boundary, which you don't have as a policy matter, but you have effectively through a compilation of policies and investment strategies. A hierarchy of centers, and those are all linked mostly by light rail, but high capacity transit. And those start with the major employment centers and work their way down to neighborhood or what we call town centers. That is mixed with industrial protections to keep that part of the economy alive. Those have been in place for 30 years now. And also green corridors within the city. Transportation options, it's not just the rail options or even the bus, but bike, peds, car sharing are all part of the mix. You're going to hear about that in the next section. And housing options is very important. All of these districts, by policy within Portland and increasingly in centers throughout the region, really focus on having not just one housing type, but a mix of sizes of family, non-family units, and a mix of affordability. So these really are complete neighborhoods, or at least that's the policy aspiration. And above all, perhaps, this focus on walkability and connectivity. We were kind of blessed with small 200 by 200 foot blocks in Portland's core from the early settlement in the 1840s, and that pattern has been replicated. It changed as a development pattern in the suburban locations, but even those locations are now reintegrating that kind of thinking into their town form, which just means you can have sort of retail and creative space everywhere, mixed in with living and with working. You can get around very easily. You don't have to walk long blocks to come back or to find your way around and so forth. Like many places that have done some kind of regional scale scenario planning, and GB will probably remember this, there were scenarios done in the early days in the mid-90s to create the regional plan, and as Colleen mentioned, this is kind of what it would look like if you did nothing else. And people went, well, okay. This was accompanied by things like visual preference surveys where people sort of looked at qualities of neighborhoods that they liked and felt that they were best achieved actually by focusing inward and starting with what you have, filling in empty lots, missing teeth, going a little bit higher in some cases, and serving that with transit options. So the end result was a regional plan, first officially adopted in 1997 and has served as a guidance for the whole region. And again, local plans for local jurisdictions have to comply with this notion. You see here in the colored dots, it's a little hard to make out the hierarchy of centers, and those are connected in by the yellow sort of rapid transit lines, but in between all of those are these neighborhood hubs and town centers, which also serve as transit supportive neighborhoods. The backbone, of course, was the light rail system, first talked about many, many years ago, but really mapped out and committed to in the 80s, and from the 90s forward, the Portland region has been aggressively building out kind of one segment at a time. Again, this is the hub and spoke notion that Dina spoke of. The future, these have all been built now. The last one, this dashed yellow line down to Milwaukee, is currently under construction, will be opening, I think, in another year. So this has been built out. And part of the lesson here, I guess I'm saying, is that this stuff takes time. It doesn't just happen overnight. The one little interesting story is that little dashed line there, the last link, the Milwaukee City Council, which is in a different county than Portland is, actually turned down their share of the light rail funding initially. They said, we don't want those Portlanders coming to our place. We don't want those people coming into our houses, taking our TVs and going away, or whatever it was. All kinds of bad stuff conjured up. They looked around, and after a while, and it took about 8 years or so, they realized they were kind of missing the boat. They were not really hooked into the rest of the region. And people there rose up, kicked the city council out, voted in a new city council, and then as a public passed a bond measure, essentially, that included their piece of the work. The Portland region didn't wait for that to happen. They were glad it did. It started building segments elsewhere. But that kind of turn in politics, I think, is part of the maturation progress. So I guess one overall lesson I'd leave you with is adjust the expectations to know this is a 50-year plan, or at least a 40-year plan, and it's not all going to happen all at once, at the same time. And it takes a lot of political change, a lot of winning of hearts and minds to do it. So start first where you have friends and can get some stuff done and set some good examples. The region does then drop down to a level below those broad regional policies to this notion of centers and corridors, which are the sort of hotspots for the major infill development, mixed-use zoning, moderate densities, we can talk about those later, lower parking standards, a real focus on the public realm design and on building design. Those qualities are really the key components of those strategies. That's sort of the what side of it. The how side of it, the successes have really come from partnership with, despite the compliance requirements, the partnerships with local councils and mayors and developers, some gap funding to start early projects that were otherwise not able to close the funding gap, which included real outreach to lenders and so forth as well. Technical assistance provided by Metro to some of the suburban jurisdictions, and we at the City of Portland, who were fairly rich in our resources and planning staff, were also able to help jurisdictions. It's not simply just a matter of public sector, though. Sometimes it's a matter of convening private developers, lenders, infrastructure people with local groups and councils to kind of really sweat the details on a particular town center or even a project within the town center. Public awareness. I think Metro, the regional government, has sort of been in an up and down cycle of how committed it is to this. It's really paid off, though, where they have made very, very strong overtures to get out of their building, engage lenders, developers, citizen leaders, activists of all stripes in making a place in each of these places. And they had a very, very compelling effort a few years ago called Get Centered, where essentially every place in the region that was doing this kind of work got a chance to show off and also to tell kind of their hardship stories and what it was taking, what they were struggling with, and how it would be nice to share experiences from other locales, which they did, and that turned out to be a very, very important engagement process. So it kind of takes it out of the technical planning realm and makes it real. Design charrettes have been really a helpful mechanism in getting people to sort of get creative and think together about the future of a very specific district. I'm going to just highlight two districts really quickly and then one kind of framework, and then I'll wrap up. The Pearl District I mentioned before, but the sort of menu here, which is, I think, instructive, was it really did focus on a mix of building types and uses. So again, it's not simply a residential district. Almost all buildings have ground floor retail or office. There are some standalone office and a few standalone residential, but they're the exception. A very keen focus on the public realm. In fact, agreements were made with developers to remove their building rights from 3 key blocks that formed a chain of parks. So they got the development rights where they could actually use them more effectively by increasing FAR and going up. But they left this wonderful legacy of parks, part of which they funded and part of which our redevelopment agency funded in terms of improvements. These are extremely well used. The streetcar was financed by an LID in great part, so really this did not fall on the public so much. And a big effort organized building owners and community members to keep all the streets and streets and public spaces really programmed well. So there are markets, there are fairs, there are art shows and so forth and so on. A lot of this bubbles up from the community and isn't coming out of the planners' heads onto paper and into the street. It really is coming from that sort of community energy. Again, using old buildings and new, a mix of different kinds of living arrangements were key there. So I went over some of these. I'm going to skip that. Really, you know, the zoning piece was the least of this. It's the one I put last. We added some bonuses in the zoning code for family-size housing and that kind of thing. But really, once the zoning was done, it was when the hard work began, and it was really these other pieces. We had design competitions for parks, lots of charrettes, and so forth and so on. This is a slide I borrowed from Dina, but it does show this. This is sort of an inner former industrial district that just had one big idea behind it, which is, can we make in Portland a 24-hour living environment? And the answer was, yeah, we could. And it really took that public-private community partnership to pull it off. Some key outcomes here: the ridership on the transit in the area doubled. The retail completely blossomed. A lot of pedestrian foot traffic there. The parking ratios dropped to less than 1 per unit. I live there. We sold one of our cars. We hardly use the one we do have. It's just a complete change of mind and of preference. Nobody said you have to get rid of that car. It just made a lot of sense to not have that extra expense. Developers were required to build to at least 90% of the zone density just to really get the activity there. And again, that's a scalable concept. You can keep that percent, but lower the density type depending on the neighborhood that you're creating and where it is on the transit system. I think I'm getting the hurry up sign from Bill here, so I'll race through here. But some key lessons here. One is the transit orientation did make a difference. That's just undisputed. And that streetcar, in this case, light rail in other cases, really boosted the impetus for creating the district in the first place and did add value to the district. There's just no question about it. But many of the other attributes of the neighborhood contributed at least as much. So you might think of that transit as a threshold requirement that's necessary but not sufficient. The other things there are really sufficient, including moving some physical obstacles, really negotiating hard with property owners to do the right thing and make deals for the open space and so forth, and to provide incentives for affordable housing. One other district really quickly, the South Waterfront, kind of the other end of the downtown of Portland. These are two both fairly close-in examples. Here was a picture we drew early on, thinking about turning this industrial land into again, a mixed-use, very urban village. What was the big idea? The big idea here was kind of a threefer. One was to make this the heart of the science and technology economy in Portland, to move it from the suburbs back into town, at least the biomedical portion of it, as opposed to the Intel information technology portion. But also to use it as a way to revitalize the river and recapture the ecological and recreational values of the riverbank. And finally, to provide a real 24-hour neighborhood again. We could do all those. This meant negotiating with a lot of institutions involved. We did a lot of this planning, again, using the small blocks, a very walkable system, but we realized the transportation obstacles were the largest piece. So we took the streetcar, we relocated the newly planned, that Milwaukee light rail alignment talked about earlier, that dash yellow line, to come across here following the purple, really connecting this district both with the downtown and the region. And then finally we needed to connect it to this mothership of the institution up on the top of the hill, which was initially platted in the 1800s in Washington, D.C. for a train station. And somebody came out here and discovered it was on the top of the hill, not the best place for a train station, so they gave it to the state. State created a medical university out of it. That university grew in stature and was busting at the seams, and so we said, how about the waterfront here rather than going out to the suburbs, and they agreed as long as we could connect it rapidly. So we actually connected it with an aerial tramway. I'm saying this is a fairly high-powered version of doing a transit-supportive district, but it shows you kind of the strategies that were employed were simply not zoning and building the transit, but really a robust set of imagination and of negotiations with institutions, private developers, and the public. Here's our little bubble, also the result of a design competition to make it less intrusive to the neighborhood below it. These people were not happy about gondola travelers peering into their living room and bathroom windows. So in the end, we actually offered to buy any of these houses that proved they could not be sold on the market for their pre-established market value, and nobody's come forward in the, I don't know, 7 years since. So there you go. There were an average of, I think, 1.5 PhDs per household in this district, and so we had a pretty vocal opposition. The bridge I mentioned, really, we thought long and hard about this and decided, you know, this is really a transit, pedestrian, and bicycle serving bridge. So this bridge has just now been completed. They're running test trains across it. It carries only light rail, streetcar, bicycles, and PEDs, possibly in the future bus rapid transit, but no vehicles, no cars, no trucks. And it's really made sense about how to really recapture the riverbank, both for that aesthetic and ecological value, but also in terms of those connections that were mentioned earlier by Bill and Dina. So some key concepts, these are a lot like in the conceptual way that we used in the Pearl District, a little bit more on steroids perhaps. But as Dina mentioned, I think the key here is really to take some of these principles and strategies and make them very, very context specific for the place you're working in. But the key message here is think outside the box. Some key lessons learned: the use of these urban design framework plans, which were done largely out of charrettes with both citizens, developers, architects, other interested people, really key in setting a vision without trying to micro-zone everything. It allowed flexibilities. Developers wanted that ability to be creative and were allowed to do that. There were assurances of the public benefits locked into those agreements very, very early on and designed in as part of that design framework. Public and private sharing of the infrastructure costs. Everybody had skin in the game was really critical. So again, think beyond the creation of the transit line to how that neighborhood's actually going to become a whole place. In the case of South Waterfront, because there really wasn't a lot of infrastructure there to begin with, unlike the Pearl District, we actually started with higher parking ratios, and then over time reduced them as more building occurs and more transit arrives in the district because of the users going up. I want to leave you with just one last framework that we developed for many of Portland's neighborhood outside of the core, something I called the 20-minute neighborhood. I was really getting frustrated with attempts to talk with neighborhoods and convince them about the right thing to do planning-wise was to upzone and to create more mixed use and transit options and so forth. It was just like getting blank stares. So this is a way of kind of reversing talking about numbers, talking planner speak, and just saying, what do you want your neighborhood to be like? And this evolved out of that conversation. And the notion that you can actually walk to your daily or weekly needs, remember only about 10% of your trips are to work. The rest are to other things. So this is kind of bringing the mountains to Muhammad, that is bringing the services closer to where you live and creating a whole neighborhood. And the 20 minutes is about the outside of a radius. You'll hear more about this from Mike a little bit later in the session. There are different ways you can draw that circle, but that's about a mile walk. So you might imagine if you're at the periphery, it might be a 10-minute walk into the center and a 10-minute walk back. There's your 20 minutes. Often you want to live even closer, but within 20 minutes you ought to get to a high school, a grade school, a library, not just your laundromat and so forth. So this proved a very interesting, and of course that disc, if you will, can slide all over the landscape. It doesn't have to be these perfectly insulated neighborhoods, but it gives you a sense, much like now is being measured through walk score, how is that actually playing out? And it has many other attributes aside from just walking distances. It does include gathering spaces, a variety of housing types, frequent transit connections, community facilities, the capacity, at least as future economics either play out or don't, to support district energy systems, particularly for heating and cooling. That's enough where you ought to have at least a community park, if not some regional green space asset within that walking distance, farmers markets, and community gardens, but also it's a kind of a nice organizing area for community action, really, which is the other piece of this. We actually, within the city of Portland, this is the city of Portland limit, not the regional boundary, we actually mapped the areas that already function as a 20-minute neighborhood, and you can see the yellow here. This is a really interesting exercise you may want to do here in the San Diego region. And you can see the blues and the purples here are less served, and that's provided kind of a new focus for the city's planning efforts going forward. So again, we offered this as kind of a template. This caught on like wildfire in Portland neighborhoods and then in the regional spaces, and has gotten a lot of traction in different places in the country over the last 10 or 12 years or so. And it goes, again, not simply to zoning, but to a lot of things that are both done by the government, in the case with some of the public realm design, but also by the community in terms of activities like these. These are popping up now in every town center in the region. I'm sure they are here as well. The eco-district concept that we pioneered in Portland kind of grew out of this effort with a bent toward energy conservation and general greening. And I think then when you put it in that kind of lens, it tells a larger story, which I think is important. And I just want to give you two key facts here about the Portland experience. One is that this shows the years from 1990 through 2006, so before the recession. Portland was sort of the region, Multnomah County, which has most of the urbanized area, was tracking the national rates for greenhouse gas emissions. But somewhere around 2000, when a lot of these policies started kicking in and being aggressive, where new transit lines were added, where there was some change in the energy mix, to be fair, not all of this is from land use and transportation. Look at the divergence there of the green line as opposed to the red. So other than Vancouver, I think Portland's the only major metropolitan area that's actually bent the curve that far down. You'll notice, though, it's only back to its 1990 absolute levels, and that's because the region has grown by the same amount of population as it's decreased those per capita emissions. But still, that's a positive trend. And so people think of Portland as green, and oh yeah, this is all great planner's dream, and you're actually getting some of it done, but what about the economy? This actually is the perfect foil to that, because this shows the major metros on the West Coast, with the exception of LA, which is so large it dwarfs everyone else, and showing that actually Portland in that same period of time had the largest per capita GDP growth. So it this does not sort of take away from the economics of an area. So don't be afraid to do this. People will be happier and the economy will prosper. The other part of the narrative is just acknowledging success, and this is really interesting. This plaque, you probably can't read it, says, "We planned, it worked." It was a very simple statement on the 25th anniversary of the 1972 downtown plan in Portland, and these plaques were placed all over different features. But again, it goes to that public consciousness and narrative that we can bend the curve, we can change things, we can take deliberate action to make things better, and you need to celebrate that, and you need to acknowledge those successes, along with the struggles and the occasional failures. So I'll just leave you with this, the final slide here, just some key lessons. I won't read all these, hopefully you can read them. And these will be available also on the website, but I guess overarching here is you need to have a combination of keeping that big idea in place for the district you're building that should be unique, but use this suite of tools. Don't be afraid to invent and negotiate very specifically for outcomes you desire there. But really start where there's fertile ground. Go where this is most likely to start and happen. Concentrate some regional resources there. Concentrate the political conversation there. Do what you need to do with developers to make it work for them, and get started and create a demonstration project, then create another one. And pretty soon these jurisdictions start sharing their stories and their information, and the kind of movement builds. We're a long way from finishing that in Portland, but that's probably been the single largest key to our success. Just remember, it does take time. Thank you.